Stuart Diver and his wife Sally were fast asleep, dreaming of the next day's ski lessons. They didn't know that beneath their floorboards, something invisible was already deciding their fate. Not an avalanche, not a storm. A leak. A slow, silent infiltration moving through soil that was never built to hold it. The ground above Thredbo was failing before anyone felt it move, and nobody was watching. There is no dramatic entry point here. No siren, no crack in the earth wide enough to see. What existed above the Thredbo lodges in July of 1997 was a road called the Alpine Way, and underneath it, a water main losing pressure into the soil, one imperceptible drop at a time. This is the anomaly investigators would spend years reconstructing. Not a single event, a process. Water finds the path of least resistance. That is not poetry, it's physics. And the path it found ran directly into the fill embankment, supporting the road above two staff lodges, Carinya and Bimbadeen below it. Guests skied. Staff worked shifts. Stuart Diver, a ski instructor, and his wife Sally slept in the lower building, inside a world that looked, by every visible measure, stable. It wasn't. Soil has a threshold. Below saturation, particles interlock. Friction holds them together, the way sand holds its shape until you pour water on it. Cross that threshold, and the same particles slide against each other with almost no resistance at all. This scientific threshold was the invisible line between Stuart Diver's peaceful sleep and the mountain turning into a liquid trap. The physics were changing, but the world inside the lodge remained blissfully, dangerously silent. The leaking main was pushing groundwater levels upward, week after week, into fill material that had already been sitting on marginal ground for decades. Nobody could see this. That's the part that should unsettle you. There was no visible slump, no obvious crack across the tarmac, nothing a passing driver would report. The failure was migrating underground, silently, while the resort function continued exactly as scheduled above it. Here's what makes this different from a landslide caused purely by weather. Rain falls, saturates a slope, and the danger is at least partially visible. Sodden ground, swollen creeks, warnings issued. This was something else. A fixed piece of infrastructure, buried and forgotten, was doing the saturating from within. Continuously, without pause, without anyone inspecting it. Think about what that means for a structure meant to bear weight for generations. The embankment beneath the Alpine Way wasn't simply exposed to nature's timeline. It was being undermined on its own private schedule, dictated by a leak nobody had located. And this is the part investigators would later find hardest to accept. The road had likely been losing integrity for a long time before that July. Weeks, potentially longer. The saturation wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. Pressure compounding on pressure, water displacing the internal friction that kept the slope from becoming, structurally speaking, a fluid. Stuart and Sally went to sleep that night in a lodge built on a hillside that looked, in every ordinary sense, like solid ground. It was not solid ground. It hadn't been solid ground for some time. What it actually was, forensically speaking, was a system already in failure, patient, unnoticed, and accelerating. The name Alpine Way would later appear in a coroner's report, cited as the origin point of the disaster, but that night it was just the road above the parking lot. Ordinary, familiar. Nobody treated it as a threat, because nothing about it, from the surface, looked like one. That's the horror of an invisible mechanism. It doesn't announce itself, it waits for the threshold. Understanding these hidden thresholds is why we analyze these cases. If you value forensic precision in storytelling, consider subscribing to Forensic Protocol, but an invisible leak alone doesn't kill 18 people. Water needs somewhere to go wrong, and the Alpine Way gave it exactly that. Justice Michael Grove, examining the collapse years later, identified something the initial inquest had already gestured toward. The slope beneath the road carried what investigators termed marginal instability, a condition that existed independently of the leak, baked into the mountainside from the moment the road was built. This is where the story stops being about bad luck and starts being about decisions. The Alpine Way was constructed using fill material, essentially compacted earth and rock brought in to build up the roadbed across uneven terrain. Fill embankments are common. They are also, structurally, only as reliable as the drainage engineered beneath them. Water has to have somewhere to exit. If it doesn't, it accumulates, and accumulation is where marginal slopes stop being marginal and start being lethal. The drainage here was inadequate, not catastrophically absent, inadequate. That distinction matters because inadequate drainage is invisible in a way that absent drainage is not. A missing drain gets noticed during construction. A drainage system that simply cannot handle a sustained, unplanned water source, like a leaking main, fails silently, exactly the way the leak itself fails silently. While engineers and government officials left these systems uninspected, the people in Bimbadeen Lodge were essentially living under a structural time bomb. Every car driving above them on the Alpine Way was a pulse of pressure against a wall that was already giving up. 2 silent failures. Layered on top of each other, neither one alone would necessarily have been catastrophic. That's the anomaly investigators kept circling back to. Systemic failure rarely announces itself as a single broken part. It's compounding neglect, small tolerances stacked on small tolerances until the aggregate becomes unsurvivable. Here's what should trouble you. The inquest ultimately tied the deaths not just to the leak, but to a government failure to make the embankment safe, given what was already known, or knowable, about its marginal stability. That phrase, marginal instability, isn't casual language. It's a forensic classification. It means the slope was already operating close to its failure threshold before a single drop of leaked water entered the equation, which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question. If the slope was already marginal, already close to its limit, how much additional stress was actually required to push it over? Not much. That's the answer the physics gives you, and it's the answer nobody wanted to hear afterward. Consider the road surface itself. Vehicles moved across it daily, adding live load to a structure whose foundation was quietly destabilizing beneath the pavement. Every ordinary Tuesday of traffic was in effect testing a system that had already lost part of its margin for error. Nobody driving that road felt anything wrong. That's what marginal instability means in practice. A structure that still performs every function asked of it, right up until the moment it categorically cannot. The road held for years, decades even. That's not evidence of safety. That's evidence of a slow clock nobody was watching, ticking toward a threshold nobody had bothered to calculate. And somewhere beneath that clock, water was still finding new places to go. Water doesn't ask permission. It moves through pore spaces in soil the same way it moves through any medium, following gradients, seeking equilibrium, entirely indifferent to what sits on top of it. The inquest would later settle on this as the principal mechanical cause, a leaking water pipe, continuously saturating the land directly above the resort for an extended period before the collapse. Not a single storm. Not one bad night of rain, though the region had also seen weeks of it. A pipe, doing what pipes do when they fail, losing water into ground never designed to absorb that volume. Here is the mechanism, stripped down to its physical bones. Soil strength comes from 2 things: the friction between particles and the cohesion holding them in structural contact. Both depend on the soil staying at a manageable moisture content. Introduce excess water, and something called pore water pressure begins to rise inside the ground itself, an internal force pushing particles apart from within, the way pressure builds inside a sealed container. As that internal pressure increases, the effective friction between soil particles decreases. Not gradually in a straight line, it can hold near normal behavior right up until a critical point and then lose strength rapidly. Engineers call the process where a solid slope transitions into a flowing mass a debris flow. The soil, in a very real sense, stops behaving like ground and starts behaving like liquid. And this is where the physics become a tragedy. The very earth that supported Stuart and Sally's home was now liquefying, losing its ability to hold them up before they even had a chance to wake up. That is not metaphor. That is measurable soil mechanics. The Alpine Way embankment, already sitting on marginal stability, was being pushed toward that exact transition. Continuously, for what investigators believe was a sustained period, by water it was never engineered to handle. Sit with that for a second. A slope holding steady for years can cross from solid to flowing in the space of hours. Once the water content passes its critical threshold, there's no warning bell built into soil mechanics, no gauge, just a threshold invisible until it's crossed. That threshold is the exact moment a vacation destination becomes a forensic site. For the 18 people inside, that invisible line was the only thing between a quiet night and 4,000 tons of debris. And weeks of regional rainfall before that July had already pushed the water table higher than it would normally sit, meaning the leaking main wasn't saturating dry ground, it was saturating ground that had almost no reserve capacity left to absorb anything further. 2 water sources, one from above, falling as rain and soaking downward, one from below, leaking laterally from a failed main directly into the fill. Meeting in the same compromised embankment, the differential pressure inside that slope kept building, water pushing outward against soil that was steadily losing the internal friction required to resist it. There is a specific moment, impossible to timestamp precisely, but mechanically real, when the embankment's shear strength dropped below the force required to hold its own mass in place. The ground could no longer support its own weight. That sentence sounds almost simple. It isn't. It's the entire disaster compressed into 8 words of pure structural failure. Everything that happened next, the sound, the speed, the 2 buildings below, was simply that sentence playing out in real time. At approximately 11:40 at night, the slope stopped resisting. It didn't crack first, it didn't groan a warning. The saturated fill, already past its threshold, transitioned almost instantly from a solid mass into a moving one, a debris flow carrying mud, rock, and shattered concrete downhill with a speed that outran any possibility of escape. Karinya Lodge sat directly in its path. The moving mass sheared Karinya from its own foundations, not damaged it, not cracked it, sheared it, ripped an entire structure loose from the ground it had stood on, and carried it, still holding its shape for a moment, down the slope like debris riding a flood. Below, Karinya sat Bimbadeen Lodge, Stuart and Sally Diver's building. The collapsing mass of Karinya, now itself part of the debris flow, was driven violently into Bimbadeen. Two buildings, compressed together by a wall of mud and rock, moving with the force of thousands of tons of unstable earth, finally released from decades of restraint. There was no interval to process what was happening, no warning shout that could have mattered. The people asleep inside those lodges had, at most, seconds, and in practical terms, likely none at all, to register the sound before the impact reached them. No chance. That has to be said plainly, because softening it does a disservice to what actually happened. There was no chance. 19 people were inside those two structures when the debris flow hit. 19 people who had gone to sleep, or were finishing a shift, or were simply present in a mountain lodge on an ordinary Wednesday night, unaware that a leak beneath the road above them had already decided the outcome. The destructive mechanics here matter even now. A debris flow isn't simply falling earth, it behaves hydrodynamically, a slurry of mud, rock, and water moving with combined mass and velocity that concentrates enormous force into whatever stands in its path. Structural walls designed to bear vertical loads have almost no resistance to a lateral impact of that magnitude. The lodges didn't merely sustain damage, they were consumed into the flow itself, timber and concrete folding into the moving mass rather than simply being struck by it. Within moments, the parking lot, the walking paths, the ordinary geography of that stretch of the resort no longer existed in recognizable form. In its place, a field of rubble, mud, and freezing debris, roughly the dimensions of the two lodges it had just erased. Somewhere beneath that field, Stuart Diver was alive. He didn't know that yet, not in any way his mind could process. Consciousness, if it existed at all in that first instant, would have been consumed entirely by the physical event itself. Pressure, darkness, the absolute absence of any reference point for up, down, or how far the world had just moved. Beside him, Sally. Neither of them had chosen anything that happened in that half second. The choice, if it can be called that, had been made years earlier, buried in a fill embankment, a drainage plan, a maintenance schedule nobody had prioritized. Silence replaces sound almost immediately after a debris flow settles. Not peaceful silence, the silence of enormous mass, pressing down, absorbing everything. Stuart Diver would later describe what surrounded him in exact terms. 4,000 tons of rubble. Concrete slabs, timber, mud, and rock. Compacted into a void barely large enough to contain a human body, a void that existed only by accident, formed by the chaotic, unrepeatable way the lodge's structure had folded in on itself during collapse. That detail matters more than it first appears. A slightly different collapse geometry, a beam angled a few degrees differently, a slab settling a foot to either side, and there would have been no void at all. No survivor. The margin between total loss and a single survivor was, in physical terms, a matter of inches. Beside him, Sally. Freezing water moved continuously through the wreckage, the same groundwater and leaked main water that had caused the collapse now flowing directly through the space where they were both trapped. It didn't stop, because the disaster had already happened. It kept moving, indifferent, exactly as it had been moving for weeks beneath the road above. The cold alone represented a serious physiological threat. Trapped in near-total darkness, unable to move his body against the crushing weight pinning him in place, Stuart's core temperature would have been under sustained assault, the early stages of what becomes, over enough hours, a slow process of cellular starvation as oxygen and warmth fail to reach tissue that the body can no longer adequately circulate to. But the physical ordeal was not the worst of it. Sally was trapped beside him, and as the water level inside their small void continued to rise, Stuart was forced to listen. Trapped, unable to help, unable to move even a few critical inches, as his wife drowned in the mud and freezing water beside him. There is no clinical term that makes that easier to hear. There shouldn't be. In those freezing hours, Stuart wasn't just fighting physics or hypothermia. He was fighting the crushing weight of a goodbye he wasn't ready to say. He had to keep breathing, not just for himself, but because he was now the only witness to the lives buried around him. Above them, rescue operations had begun almost immediately. But the debris field they were searching represented one of the most hazardous emergency environments Australian rescue teams had ever encountered, a massive unstable rubble that could shift, settle or collapse further with no warning, threatening to crush both victims and rescuers with any wrong movement. Hours passed without any indication that anyone remained alive beneath the wreckage. Rescue crews worked cautiously, methodically, aware that reckless speed could trigger a secondary collapse and eliminate any chance of finding survivors at all. Underneath it all, Stuart remained conscious, in a void defined by darkness, cold, and the sound of machinery working somewhere above him. Machinery that had no way of knowing exactly where to dig, and no way of knowing he was still alive to be found. 61 hours. That is how long the wreckage held its silence before anything changed. 61 hours of excavators working across an unstable debris field, roughly the size of 2 buildings, searching for any sign at all, that someone remained alive beneath 4,000 tons of rubble. A search dog, trained to detect the specific signature of a living human beneath collapsed structure, moved across a section of the debris and stopped, held position, indicated, with the kind of certainty a trained animal displays and a machine cannot fake, that something beneath that exact point warranted attention. Rescuers brought in listening equipment, sensitive enough to detect sound through layers of concrete, mud and timber that would otherwise render a human voice completely undetectable. They lowered a probe, listened. A faint sound, not a shout, not anything close to it. After 61 hours trapped in freezing water beside his wife's body, Stuart Diver's voice had been reduced to barely more than a whisper. But a whisper, transmitted through a listening device into the ears of rescuers who had spent nearly 3 days searching without confirmation that anyone remained alive to find. That faint sound changed everything about the operation. What had been a recovery effort, conducted with the grim caution of teams expecting only bodies, became something else entirely, a live rescue, which meant an entirely different set of constraints. Because now, every decision about how to move rubble, which slab to lift first, which support beam to test before committing weight to it, carried the added urgent variable of a living person somewhere in the path of that excavation. Rescuers began speaking directly to Stuart through the listening equipment, offering the only thing they could offer from above: reassurance and instructions. Stay still. Stay conscious. Help was coming. But help required a precision that could not be rushed, not when a wrong movement could bring the remaining unstable mass down directly onto the one survivor they'd just confirmed was alive. The excavation that followed was by every account painstaking. Specialist teams worked slab by slab, timber beam by timber beam, aware that the same chaotic collapse geometry that had created Stuart's survival void could just as easily reverse itself and crush him the instant the wrong piece of debris shifted. 12 more hours passed after his voice was first detected. 12 hours of controlled, deliberate extraction, while a man who had already survived 61 hours in the dark waited, alone, beside his wife's body, for a sound from above to become a hand reaching down into the wreckage. He had made it past the discovery. He had not yet made it out. Stuart Diver was lifted from the wreckage 12 hours after rescuers first heard his voice, 65 hours after the Alpine Way gave way above him. He was the only one. 18 people did not leave that debris field. Sally did not leave it. The forensic record that followed would spend years establishing in exhaustive technical detail exactly why. The coroner's findings were direct. A leaking water main had saturated the Alpine Way fill embankment, and that saturation was the mechanical trigger for the collapse. Justice Michael Grove's later findings added the fuller picture: the leakage from the main, combined with the marginal instability already present in the slope beneath the road, combined again with a documented failure to improve either the road or the slope, despite known risk. Together, these formed the causal chain. Not one failure, a system of them, layered across years, each one individually survivable. None of them ever addressed in isolation, all of them converging on a single mountainside on a single night. The inquest was unambiguous about the principal cause: a leaking water pipe, saturating land above the resort, for a sustained period before the ground finally lost the strength to hold itself together. That finding didn't require speculation. It required tracing water, pressure and soil composition back to a source that had been there, leaking, long before anyone recognized the danger it represented. This was Australia's deadliest landslide. 18 dead. 1 survivor, 2 lodges erased from a mountainside in the space of what investigators estimate was well under a minute after a failure that had been building, quietly, for far longer than a minute could ever contain. The forensic conclusion stands on its own, without embellishment required. A road built on marginal ground. A leaking main beneath it, never detected. Water pressure rising inside a slope already close to its structural limit. A threshold crossed, silently, on an ordinary Wednesday night in July. Systemic failure, in the end, is rarely loud until the very last moment. It was not loud here either, not until 11:40 at night, when a mountainside that had already failed made that failure visible to everyone at once. That visibility came too late for Thredbo, proving that what we don't see is often what haunts us most. To understand how others fought against the impossible in the world's most frozen reaches, click here to watch the story of the men who drank fire to survive Antarctica, or explore our full forensic archive. The lessons are there, if we choose to look.